Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of the origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Kenneth Miller, who is Professor of Biology and the Royce Family Professor for Teaching Excellence at Brown University. His prime research focus is the structure and function of cell membranes, especially chloroplast thylakoid membranes. And tonight, he's going to tell us about the human difference, how evolution fashioned the Earth's most extraordinary creature. Please join me in welcoming Professor Miller.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. This is my fourth or fifth visit to Cleveland and to Case, and I'm always happy to come back. I want to get right to it. And I want to start with the culprit in question, and that is Charles Darwin. Darwin, like many of our students today, you might say unfortunately, graduated from university with no job prospects, and therefore was forced to take an unpaid internship. Sound familiar? His unpaid internship was as the ship's naturalist on HMS Beagle. From this 5-year unpaid internship, he made something happen. And that is he wrote a book on the voyage of the Beagle. And you can see it up here next to his portrait. This book established Darwin as a naturalist, gave him a reputation within Britain and throughout the English-speaking world as someone who really understood nature. If you read The Voyage of the Beagle carefully, it was published about 20 years before The Origin of Species, you can see Darwin beginning to settle on a revolutionary idea. And that revolutionary idea was that species were not fixed. And in a letter to a colleague, Darwin articulated that idea, but also said it feels almost like confessing a murder. Well, it took the prodding of another colleague, Alfred Russel Wallace, who actually came up with the idea of evolution quite independently to prod Darwin into publishing his great work, which is on the origin of species. What was the reaction to that in Victorian Britain? Well, among naturalists, there was quite a bit of support. But among society in general, there was some concern. And there is a story that circulates, perhaps an apocryphal story, that the reaction within Victoria England went something like this. And that is, among polite society, people whispered about Darwin's theory and said, let us hope that it is not true. But if it is true, let us hope that it does not become generally known. Now, we can snicker at that today, but it turns out across the pond, in the United States, by the beginning of the 20th century, a number of American states had tried to do exactly that, to make sure that evolution did not become generally known. The photograph you see here is from the landmark Scopes trial in 1925, and John Scopes, a substitute teacher, was actually put on trial for violating the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of any theory that denied the divine origin of man. Now, as it turns out, the case was a setup. John Scopes was sort of a volunteer, and the Civil Liberties Union really wanted a test case to try to show that this law was unreasonable at best and unconstitutional at worst. Now, many people today think that the Scopes trial humiliated the opponents of evolution. And if they think that, that's probably because they're actually looking at a dramatization, a play and a movie called Inherit the Wind. In fact, Inherit the Wind is not an accurate retelling of the Scopes trial, even though the two characters, the primary characters, the attorneys, are indeed modeled after the two dueling attorneys in the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. In reality, John Scopes was convicted. He was fined $100 for the crime of teaching evolution. Some of you may know that that fine was set aside because Tennessee law required all fines greater than $50 to be assessed by a jury, and this was a bench trial. So the good news is Mr. Scopes never had to pay the $100. The bad news is his conviction stood. And it turns out that well into the 1960s, when I was in high school, the teaching of evolution remained banned in 6 American states, which is an extraordinary statement at the beginning of the space age. All of that changed, or I should say began to change, in 1965 when Susan Epperson, a brand new high school biology teacher at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And if that name rings a bell, it should. Central High School in Little Rock has produced more than its share of American history. And if you're too young to know the history of Central High, look it up because it's remarkable. Susan produced lesson plans for her course, which she then presented to her department chair that included a full week of lessons from the textbook on evolution. Her department chair pulled her aside and said, "Susan, you're a great teacher. I don't want to lose you. Take evolution out of the lesson plans." "Why?" she said. "Because teaching evolution is against the law in the state of Arkansas, and I don't care, but somebody else might notice, and I don't want you to get in trouble." So I want you to think of this. Here we have a first-year biology teacher convinced that her state has an unjust law. So what does she do? She sues the state of Arkansas with the support of her teachers union. She actually wins the case in district court. The state of Arkansas appeals to the state Supreme Court, and the Attorney General of Arkansas shows up in person in front of the state Supreme Court to argue for the law. The state Supreme Court reverses the decision, reinstates the law. Susan then takes it to the Supreme Court of the United States. And Epperson versus Arkansas is the decision under which all the anti-evolution laws in the United States were invalidated. Now, a bit later, I became involved in some court cases I will tell you about. And because I testified on the first day of a very highly publicized trial, I got an awful lot of letters and email, one of which came from this person who said, "I think I know some of what you went through, because years ago I was involved in litigation regarding the theory of evolution too." And I thought, who is this? And I scanned to the bottom of the letter and it says Susan Epperson. And I just about died. And I wrote back to her via email and said, "You are a rock star to me, so I will autograph a book," which she wanted to send me, under one condition, and it's non-negotiable. And that is, you have to send me a photograph of yourself, autographed, that I can hang up in my office. So 2 weeks later, the book comes, which I autograph. I open the package, and here is this photograph. So it's a very pretty young girl, obviously Susan Epperson, sitting next to a very old guy. Now, with no offense intended to anyone in the room, all 80-year-old guys look pretty much the same. So I have no idea who this is. Then I turned the picture over, and in soft pencil, Susan had written on the back, "This is a picture of me and John Scopes." And a chill went down my spine. John Scopes was in ill health, but he lived just long enough to see this pretty young teacher invalidate the very law under which he had been convicted. Now, as you heard in the introduction, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm a cell biologist. And I'm sitting in my office one day. How did I get interested in evolution? So it's 1982. I'm doing work in my equipment. I am high as a kite because a paper that I wrote had not only just been published in the journal Nature, the most prestigious journal in the world, but it got the cover. And this turned out to be the very month in which the committee at Brown was voting on whether or not to give me tenure. I made certain that every single member of the tenure committee had a copy of the journal. It was important. So I get a phone call. And the phone call is actually from a former student of mine at another university named Joe Levine. And Joe says, "Hey, Ken, how'd you like to write a high school biology book with me?" Now, I grew up in New Jersey. Think Chris Christie. I can be kind of coarse at times. And I responded to Joe very coarsely. I put on the slide, "Hey, what are you, nuts?" I actually told him where he could stick it, because I'm at a research university writing a textbook. That's really no credit for promotion. You know, go away, go away. Bless his heart, Joe did not go away. He talked me into it. And a mere 8 years later, our very first textbook came out. There's a curse that's associated with having a successful textbook. This is a 9th grade high school biology textbook. And the curse is, because science changes, if your book is successful, you got to do it again, and you got to do it again, and you got to keep doing it. And we now actually have a 5th version of our book that just came out this year. Now, why did this get me interested in evolution? evolution's the central organizing principle of everything in biology. But it turns out, quite innocently, Joe and I wrote about this, but we suddenly discovered it got us in trouble. So for example, Cobb County, Georgia, bless their hearts, they adopted this version of our textbook for their 13 high schools. Thank you very much. But because of pressure in the community, they were actually obliged to slap a warning sticker on all of our books to tell students that evolution was just a theory, is subject to doubt, don't take it too seriously. Well, it turns out there was a court case in Cobb County that resulted in those stickers being removed. If I had more time, I'd tell you all about it. But the court case I really do want to tell you about took place later the next year in a small town called Dover, Pennsylvania, where the school board instructed the teachers to prepare a curriculum on something called intelligent design. The teachers, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused because they said this stuff is not science. What provoked the school board? The answer is the teachers had picked our textbook. And one of the members of the school board said, from cover to cover, this book is laced with Darwinism. You know how authors sometimes take a quote that's very favorable and put it on the back of the book to entice you to buy it? I've been thinking about putting that on the back of our book, thinking biology teachers would like that. Well, it turns out 11 parents of children in the school sued the Board of Education. The case was heard in 2005. It was known as Kitzmiller versus Dover. I had the honor, although I don't think honor was the right word, of being the lead witness for those 11 parents. Here I am walking into court on the first day of the trial, and this is the NBC TV courtroom sketch of me being cross-examined by the attorney for the Board of Education. Those are my textbooks that are piled up on the desk, used as evidence against me. A lot of people congratulated me for this, but by this time I'm saying, man, I'm a tenured professor at an Ivy League university. This took no courage at all, and I mean that. You want to know the people who were courageous? The plaintiffs like Tammy Kitzmiller, and above all, the teachers, Dover High School, who stood up to their own school board, risked their jobs in order to stand up for science. Well, if you're interested in learning about this, no fewer than 4 books have been written about this trial, and 2 TV specials, one by the BBC and one by Nova, called Judgment Day. This was an extraordinary case. It turns out just before Christmas, the decision was announced by the judge, who, by the way, is a lifelong Republican, a conservative jurist, and an appointee of President George W. Bush. And he announced simply, this intelligent design stuff, it's not science. Front page news on everything from USA Today to the New York Times. Lead story on the nightly news of all the networks, and as it turns out, basically set off rejoicing among all of the parents in Dover public schools who had actually sued the Board of Education. This had nationwide effect. 2 months after the Kitzmiller decision, right here in Ohio, the Board of Education, looking across the border, what happened in Pennsylvania, eliminated ID sort of bias science standards. This also happens to coincide with the school board election in the state of Kansas. Kansas had been infamous for basically anti-evolution activity. It turns out pro-science candidates swept the school board elections in Kansas as well. I'd love to pretend these ideas had their day in court. They fell on their face. The scientific community rose up as one, and surely we did, and beat this horse dead. Well, it turns out it's not quite true. There is still another wave of anti-evolution activity. These headlines are just from the past 2 years. There have been anti-evolution bills introduced in a number of states around the country. The most notable one, the most notable struggle going on right now is in the state of Florida, where the new education commissioner of the state of Florida said, and I quote, "I won't support any evolution being taught as fact in any of our schools." And this is a battle that we continue to face. Our new textbook went into Florida. That was the very first state that we went into, and I had to defend it constantly from one challenge after another. So here's basically where I want to break the first part of our talk. I think there is absolutely no question that evolution will continue to win the scientific struggle of ideas. A great evolutionary biologist, Theodosios Dobzhansky, once wrote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, and he was right. But for many people, even people who are not motivated by religious considerations, There's a concern about evolution, and it's a concern that strikes at the very heart of what it means to be human. And that concern is, what does it mean about our own human self-image to realize that we are creatures who have been fashioned by the hand of evolution? What does that mean for morality, for human society, and for our own image as a species?
If I recall correctly, didn't Judge Jones refer two of the school board members for perjury charges?
He did. And I was talking about this trial with a group of students today, and I went through part of the trial transcripts where one of the members of the Board of Education perjured himself. In other words, gave sworn testimony, which he then contradicted 10 minutes later, and he was the only person in the courtroom who didn't realize that he had just perjured himself. He didn't understand what all the snickering was about. And I met Judge Jones about a year after the trial. I wasn't sure if it was proper to speak to a judge in a case in which you had been involved, but I met him at a meeting, and he said, let's go out for a beer. And we talked about this, and he said he had referred two of them to the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Pennsylvania for perjury charges. And the attorney apparently visited Judge Jones in his chambers after the referral, and he said, look, John, I got drug dealers, I got mass murderers, I got serious criminals to prosecute. These people have disgraced themselves in front of their own community. That's punishment enough. And that's why no prosecutions were forthcoming.
Well, of course, intelligent design and creationism are not science, but the idea that evolution is a theory is correct. It's also very, very well confirmed by all of the evidence. So I would think that one might take advantage of that to teach the scientific method and what it means to have a theory and confirm it.
I completely agree. In our textbooks, Joe Levine and I have done the best we can at that, and I'll sort of explain it this way. In ordinary lingo, the word theory is like a guess or hunch or something like that. So when I was actually testifying in trial, remember it's 2005, okay? I'm a baseball fan. Incredibly, the Boston Red Sox the season before had won the World Series, and they came back from the New York Yankees against the New York Yankees in the playoffs when they're down 3-0. And I told the court that I could not think of a single rational explanation for how this team of bums was actually able to do that. So the only theory that I thought was reasonable was that God had just had enough of George Steinbrenner, and he decided to teach him a lesson. And that explained the Red Sox victory. So it got some laughs and that sort of stuff. But here's the interesting thing. Many people think fact is a high level of understanding. Theory is a higher level of understanding. And the way I like to explain this is, let's suppose a young person came here to Case Western to study physics. One of the required subjects that they would have to study to get a degree in physics is a topic we call atomic theory. Now, why do we call this atomic theory? Is it because it's just a theory that atoms exist? Well, of course not. We know very well that atoms exist. What atomic theory does is to unify hundreds of thousands of experimental facts under a single explanatory umbrella. And that's what we call atomic theory. What evolutionary theory does is to unify hundreds of thousands of biological facts and observations in a single explanatory framework. So the best way to put it is that theories in science never become facts. Theories in science explain facts. And I think once students understand that, they realize to say that evolution is just a theory is a lot like saying the Copernican theory of the solar system, the germ theory of disease. As you said, it's a very well-supported theory.
Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Ken Miller discussing the history of how evolution was received in this country. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Professor Miller will discuss the evidence that humans evolved from other animals. Now, back to the talk.
Remember what I said. Let's suppose basically you want to come to grips with what it means to be a creature of evolution. So I want to start out with a hypothetical. And the hypothetical is this. Let's suppose somebody told you you're just an animal. A lot of species on this planet, you're just another one. You, in fact, have been programmed by natural selection not to seek truth and beauty, but to do nothing more than survive and mate. and we can explain all human behavior on the basis of those two instincts. And not only that, you're just a collection of matter, mindless matter. Consciousness and free will, those are just illusions. You're not really conscious. That's a trick the matter of your brain is playing on you. And frankly, given the size of the known universe, you're pretty much insignificant. You just don't matter. If that's what evolution means, how would you feel about evolution then? Meaning accepting evolution meant accepting all of those things. Well, many scientists have said exactly those things, and that's worth pointing out. Now, one of the people who has most eloquently expressed unease with evolution is one of America's greatest writers, Marilynne Robinson, who's won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize, and so forth. If you don't know Marilynne Robinson, read her books. She is a marvelous writer. Gilead is probably her best known work. She's absolutely an extraordinary prose stylist and writer. She also writes essays. And she basically, in a book of essays called The Death of Adam, which I'll get to in a second, she warns people about the dangers of what she calls Darwinism. And I'll get to her concerns about those dangers first. But first, as a biologist, I want to ask a more basic question. Is evolution really true? Can we be really sure that our species evolved from non-human ancestors? Well, two of the expert witnesses who testified in the Kitzmiller trial, I'm one, and the other scientist who testified was Kevin Padian. And Kevin's a paleontologist from Cal Berkeley. His testimony was marvelous, and what Kevin focused on was the fossil record. And the human or the pre-human fossil record is now abundant. People like to say, well, you've never found the missing link. The problem is we have found so many missing links that it's hard to tell which is our direct ancestor, which is our distant cousin, which is our crazy uncle up in the attic. There have been so many pre-human species found that the hard part is not having enough dots, it's how to connect the dots. Now, many people still insist that there is indeed a gap between human and non-human primates in the fossil record. One of my good colleagues, Nicholas Matsky, now Dr. Matsky, decided to graphically show people how this this imagined gap is not real. And what Nick did was to take a paper that published in a table the cranial sizes, the brain sizes, of all authenticated skulls, pre-human and human, discovered in the last 5 million years. That's the paper. It's very boring. It's just page after page of tables. I do not urge you to read it, even though I have the citation up there. But here's what Nick did. He plotted against the age of the fossil, the time before present, it plotted its cranial capacity. Every single dot you see in that chart is an individual specimen. It's color-coded according to the species, whether it's Australopithecus or Homo or one of the other subspecies of those. And I ask you, do you see a dot? Do you see a gap? What you see instead is a smooth and continuous rise from about 400 cubic centimeters up to about 1,400 cubic centimeters, which is the average human brain size today. Do we want for missing links? No. We have so many missing links that are no longer missing. Again, as I mentioned, the hard part is how to connect the dots. But I'm not a fossil person. I'm a DNA and RNA person by and large. And to me, the most extraordinary evidence for human evolution is actually written right in our DNA sequences. And a quote from this article, this special issue on the chimpanzee genome is right here. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. This came out just before the trial. I was very eager to bring this molecular evidence into the trial. And the attorneys I was working with said, what do you want to talk about then? I want to talk about the degree of conservation of synteny between all the primates. They said, Ken, you have to put this in terms that are so simple that even an attorney can understand them, because that's what the judge was. So I want to show you some of the examples that I gave the judge. The ancestors of the embryos of placental mammals, like us, produce what's known as a yolk sac. Now, the interesting thing is we humans and all other placental mammals don't produce yolky eggs. Reptiles do. In a reptile, or for that matter in a bird, the embryo produces a sac which encloses the yolk and mobilizes nutrition. What happens to us? Well, it turns out that we also, during our embryonic development, produce a yolk sac, but there's no yolk in it. The yolk sac is empty. Why do we go through a developmental stage in which we produce a structure that encloses pretty much nothing? Well, the answer, from the point of view of evolution, is because mammals like us evolved from animals that did have yolk-containing eggs. The fossil record shows the earliest mammals evolved from a certain group of reptiles. Now, here's the interesting thing. I said I was an RNA and a DNA guy. So the embryos of placental mammals retain an empty yolk sac. Here's the insight. If the ancestors of mammals once had yolk, the mammalian genome might still contain the remnants of the genes for the yolk protein vitellogenin. So we now have the tools that we can look at the human genome and we can say, do we have fossil remnants of these yolk protein genes anywhere in our genome? Well, a few years ago, a group of scientists decided to test for that, and the answer was yes. In fact, the human genome has remnants, non-functional, of all 3 yolk protein genes. They're called VIT1, VIT2, and VIT3. They're doing nothing, but they reflect the fact that we, like all placental mammals, have ancestry with organisms that once laid eggs, even though they're not doing anything in our genome. The late Stephen Jay Gould, one of the greatest writers on evolution ever, called such things a senseless sign of history. And I'll read a little quote from his book, Panda's Thumb. Darwin reasoned, if organisms have a history, the ancestral segment should leave remnants behind, remnants of the past that don't make sense in present terms. They supplied proof the world was not made in its present form. And that's exactly what these remnants in our genome display. I want to show you another example that I gave the judge. We humans have 46 chromosomes. Every student learns that in high school biology. Also, we share recent common ancestors with the other African great apes, gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. But here's the interesting thing. Those guys have 48 chromosomes. We only have 46. So we have 23 pairs, they have 24. How do we explain this fact that humans seem to be lacking a pair of chromosomes? Well, the only explanation that's consistent with evolutionary common ancestry is the 2 chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates got accidentally stuck together to form a single chromosome in us. And that would have dropped us from 24 pairs down to 23. However, that's not evidence, that's just conjecture. But here's the thing about evolution, it's testable. If we indeed descended from organisms that had 48 chromosomes, how would we detect it? Turns out to be pretty easy. The tips of every chromosome have a highly repetitive DNA sequence called the telomere sequence. Near the middle is an equally special sequence called the centromere. If you and I are carrying around a chromosome right now that was formed by the fusion of 2 separate chromosomes, you know what it should look like? It should have telomere DNA, that's shown in blue on the slide, in the middle of the chromosome. And that fused chromosome should also have 2 centromere sequences. If we scan our genome and we don't find a chromosome like that, the hypothesis of common ancestry is in big trouble. Well, guess what? I will not keep you in suspense. We have exactly such a chromosome. It's human chromosome number 2. It has every sign that I just mentioned. And I want to mention also that since the trial, our human genome databases have gotten much more precise. So before I prepared this talk, I went to the Human Genome Browser. You see a map up here of human chromosome number 2. Please notice that one side has a different color than the other side. That's because the 2 sides of human chromosome number 2 correspond to chimpanzee chromosome 12 and 13. Those are the 2 chromosomes that fused. We can go further. And that is, we can go in and we can look at the actual DNA basis, the A's, T's, G's, and C's. And what do we find? We find that at the fusion point, there's a set of genes to the left and another set of genes to the right, and they correspond to the exact order of those genes on chimpanzee, and for that matter, gorilla, chromosome 12 and 13. And I can go right down to the level of DNA bases, and I can see the exact point at which those 2 chromosomes come together. This confirms our common ancestry with these organisms in a way, and I always try to tell people DNA sequences are not theories, they're not hypotheses. DNA sequences are facts. And this is a fact that is written in the language of our genome. Now again, I asked you to consider, what does this mean for us? In the 19th century, even among evolutionary biologists, it was common to give us a tree of life. And in the tree of life, human beings were put at the very pinnacle. Makes you feel pretty good, doesn't it? To be right at the top of the tree with the so-called lower organisms down there. But that's not the way in which we look at the tree of life today. We look at it as more of an exploding web. We mammals are just one tiny corner of that, and we humans are one tiny corner of the mammalian line. And science writer Brian Switek put it this way: there never was an ascent of man, no matter how desperately we wish there to be. We are just a shivering twig that is the last vestige of a richer family tree. Prolific science blogger P.Z. Meyer put it more bluntly: we humans aren't any more special to the universe than a sea slug. If that doesn't take you down a notch, I don't know what will. Although I have to tell you, sea slugs are really cool, and I could go on in great length about that. Frans de Waal, a really famous behavioral ecologist who's a marvelous writer, wrote a book called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And here's what Frans said. We see a creature in humans of flesh and blood with a brain that, albeit 3 times larger than a chimp, doesn't contain any new parts. Our intellect might be superior, but we have no basic needs or wants that cannot also be observed in our close relatives. We are, in fact, no big deal. And that is what Marilyn Robinson was reacting to when she warned about the danger of Darwinism. Is there a way to accept evolution and still think that human beings are special?
Do we know if the fusion gave us any capabilities that were different?
That's a really good question. And I get emails saying, if we took a chimp and we fused those 2 chromosomes together, would we have a baby human being? And the answer is no. As far as we can tell, that had absolutely no significance. The same sorts of genes are on both sides of the fusion that were there in separate chromosomes. It turns out to be no big deal. And it also turns out that chromosomal fusions happen all the time. For example, the closest thing we have on this planet to truly wild, never domesticated horses are the wild Mongolian horses, sometimes called Przewalski's horse. They, as it turns out, have 66 chromosomes. All domesticated horses have 64. And we know exactly where the 2 chromosomes are that fused. It turns out if you go to Wikipedia and you see how many chromosomes do mice have, the textbook answer is 40. But there are, on certain islands in the Atlantic, races, that's what they call them, of mice that have 28 chromosomes, 30 and 32. And it's all the result of chromosome fusions. There are 2 scientific reports now in the literature, last 10 years. One of a family in Spain and one of a family in China, a perfectly healthy family in which all the members have 44 chromosomes, because a chromosomal fusion had occurred in one of their ancestors. So as far as we can tell, the fusion didn't make us human. Incidentally, and this is really cool, I just got off on this when I realized the Neanderthal database is now complete enough for me to be able to go in and check, did the fusion occur in prior to Neanderthal? The answer is yes. There's a group of organisms known as the Denisovans. That database is finally rich enough to ask it too. They also have the chromosomal fusion. So the fusion probably occurred 4 or 5 million years ago in an ancestor of all present-day living humans, but it never occurred in our primate relatives.
Of the major religions, what religion is closest to accepting evolution?
What religion is closest to accepting evolution? There are a number of religions that accept it fully. Many of my Buddhist friends say that Buddhism has no problem with evolution. Some of my other non-Buddhist friends say, well, that's cool, but Buddhism's not really a religion. So we can talk about that. I've also discovered that a number of scientists in the Hindu tradition basically are fully accepting of evolution. And I would also point out that many of the major Christian denominations also accept evolution. And as an example, I'll hold up a very large faith that is generally considered to be backward on scientific issues, and that's the Roman Catholic faith. The first pope to write an encyclical supporting evolution was Pius XII, and he wrote it in 1947, the year before I was born. A total of 4 popes, Pius XII, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the current Pope Francis, have all written or spoken in defense of evolution. And Pope Francis several years ago said, look, God is not a magic wand. Scientific processes like the Big Bang and evolution are real, and we as Christians should accept them as such. Having said that, a lot of people within the Catholic Church still have a little problem with this whole idea of common ancestry. I would also point out a Pew survey of American attitudes correlated with religious life show that within the US, the groups least accepting of evolution are Jehovah's Witnesses and LDS, Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. The declared religious group that's most acceptance is Reform Judaism. So there's a whole spectrum of acceptance. I'll tell you one other thing, and I think that the notion of the chromosomal 2 fusion is enormously powerful evidence for evolution. When I speak to a university audience, I will often show the same slides I just showed you. Usually it's an audience full of students. And I'll ask the students, how many of you knew about the composition of human chromosome number 2 before you came tonight? Usually 3 or 4 hands will go up. Here's a grad student, over there's a genetics professor, over there is a molecular biologist. Those are the only people who knew. And then I ask them, do you know whose fault that is, that you don't know? It's my fault. And it's the fault of everyone within the scientific establishment who has been too reticent to go out and popularize this bit of science. And by popularize, I don't mean tell everyone, go, gee whiz, let's have a party. By popularize, I mean make this part of our general scientific knowledge that we teach in schools, that we understand, so that people really understand how powerful that evidence is. And I think the scientific establishment all too often has done a very poor job of letting people know what we know for sure. And I think that's a failing.
Question here, which I will ask on her behalf, which is, how does fusion happen? Is it a fluke?
The fusions between chromosomes are so common among vertebrates that they even have a jargon name. They're called Robertsonian translocations. You can look it up. Now, it turns out, I mentioned that the tips of chromosomes have this highly repeated DNA sequence to them. It's 6 bases, and it's repeated as much as 1,000 times. It's called the telomere sequence. Telomere means the end of chromosomes. And I don't have time to go into this, but the ends of chromosomes, if you have 2 DNA strands that would just end, they tend to fray. They tend to break apart. So the telomere actually enables one of the strands to bend back and base pair with the other, making what's called a T-loop that basically is like a knot at the end of the chromosome that protected literally against fraying. Well, it turns out that the T-loop doesn't always form properly, and sometimes the number of telomere repeats is reduced from one generation to another. There's a special enzyme called telomerase, which normally replicates these, but as we get older, telomerase becomes less and less effective, so there's more and more damage to the telomere regions of chromosomes. One of the things that's happened, and my good friend and colleague Virginia Zakian at Princeton University has done these experiments. If you knock out some of the key telomerase genes, what happens is the telomeres of chromosomes begin to fray, they begin to wear, until finally they get so short that chromosomes will fuse with each other. So it's basically an accumulation of genetic damage to the end of the chromosome that makes it liable to fuse. So it is a fluke in that sense, but we also understand the mechanism which causes it.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Ken Miller. Dr. Miller is Professor of Biology and Royce Family Professor for Teaching Excellence at Brown University. In the second part of our talk, we discuss genetic evidence that humans have evolved from other animals. In our final segment, Professor Miller will discuss the application of evolution to psychology and the question of whether there is anything special about humans. Now, back to our talk.
I just read you a series of quotes sort of dethroning the idea of human exceptionalism, and I want to read you a really good one here by Henry Gee, who wrote a book called The Accidental Species. Henry Gee is very prominent in the scientific establishment. He used to be the editor-in-chief of Nature. That's a really important job. And in his book, he wrote the following. Giraffe scientists would no doubt write of evolutionary progress in terms of longer necks rather than larger brains or tools. So much for human superiority. If that's not ignominy enough, bacterial scientists would no doubt ignore humans, except as convenient habitats, the passive scenery against which the bacterial drama is cast, because of course bacteria live within us and they're very happy down there. Then Guy writes, now ask yourself, which of these stories is more valid than any other, at least as a narrative? So the human story is no more important than the giraffe story or the bacterial story. However, I think in their eagerness to sort of demote the human species, both Guy and Duval and many others have overlooked something important. Remember what he wrote, giraffe scientists would write about blah, blah, blah. Here's the problem. There are no giraffe scientists. There are no bacterial scientists, and no books written by them about us, even though we write books about them. And that's an important thing to appreciate. Among all the species on this planet, we are the species that invented science, and we are the only species, as far as we know, that is aware of the process of evolution that created us. That is a critical distinction. Among evolutionary psychologists in particular, you see a claim repeated over and over again. David Sloan Wilson in New York is one of those who makes that claim, and that is that evolution can be used to explain all human behavior. And David has written the following, evolution, as we learn more about it, will include all human knowledge. And he wrote, nothing about X makes sense except in the light of evolution, where X can equal anthropology, art, culture, economics, history, politics, psychology, religion, and sociology. So in other words, evolution is going to explain your taste in music, your taste in art, social structures, everything else. The great evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson has argued exactly the same thing in his book Consilience. And he argues that the adaptive values of humans' customs, behaviors, and institutions permits evolution to explain all of them. And one of the things that he wrote is that the human mind evolved to believe in gods, but it did not evolve to believe in biology. Now I know Ed Wilson. If there was a Nobel Prize for evolution, he would have won at least 2 of them. He's a wonderful fellow. He's still productive well into his late 80s. He writes brilliantly, but that sentence, the human mind did not evolve to believe in biology, struck me. The human mind invented biology. Biology is a human creation. And to the extent that we can do science, science itself is a product of the human mind. Now, supposedly, your psychology and mine was shaped by evolutionary pressures in the Pleistocene. So many scientists argue that the reason men behave this way, you'll see the example in a second, or women behave that way, was because back in caveman times, this is what men did, and this is what women did, and this is why we have these preferences. But as it turns out, and this is an article written by Anthony Gottlieb, with which I completely identify, we know so little about the environment of our Pleistocene ancestors, what they were like, where they lived, that just about any hypothesis about which strategies might have enabled them to reproduce and let their characteristics ripple through the gene pool is bound to be highly speculative. I'll give you an example of that. About 10 years ago, a flurry of articles came out, supposedly based on evolutionary research. You love the titles here, Why Women Cannot Read Maps and Men Lose Their Keys. My favorite is Shopping is a throwback to the days of cave women, and it explained the reason women like to shop is because while the bold men were out hunting and spearing large animals, women were collecting berries, going through the woods, finding the right twigs to build a fire. So they're doing all this domestic stuff, and that's why women like to shop. That's why men like to watch football, because it reminds us of when we went out with spears and we hunted mastodons and so forth and so on. And I have to say, the most extreme conclusions of evolutionary psychology stem from false confidence about the nature of the human past, let's take that women love to shop because of these pressures, men like violent sports because of these pressures. But let's remember something. Every one of us grew up in societies that reinforced these and a host of other cultural stereotypes. And teasing out what is genetic about our evolutionary ancestry and what is inculcated by the very great power of culture, which any parent of an adolescent is extremely aware of, is something that is very difficult to do. Now, I have to say I was very proud when these articles came out that Discover magazine rated that article about why women love to shop as the worst science article ever. And I completely and totally agree. I prefer to take the side of someone whose name some of you, I hope, will remember, and that is Jacob Bronowski. And more than 30 years ago, Bronowski hosted a television series called The Ascent of Man. These days it would have to be The Ascent of Humans or something like that. But the point is made. He also published a book on that basis. And I don't know how many of you saw the Bronowski series, The Ascent of Man, but it was extraordinary. And he began the first episode like this. And he wrote that man is a singular creature. He has a set of gifts that make him unique among the animals, so that unlike them, he is not a figure in the landscape, he is a shaper of the landscape. In body and mind, he is the explorer of nature, the ubiquitous animal who did not find, but instead made his home in every continent. And I think that's a marvelous description of our species. Now, behavioral scientists like B.F. Skinner and Konrad Lorenz have studied respectively rats and ducks to use their social conditioning to explain human behavior. And indeed, these are landmark studies in psychology that I think anyone taking courses would learn about. And you'd learn about the work of Skinner and the work of Lorenz. But here's what Bronowski wrote about this. These studies tell us something about man, but they cannot tell us everything. Why? Well, there must be something unique about man, because otherwise the ducks would be lecturing about Konrad Lorenz and the rats would be writing papers about B.F. Skinner. And I think that's the key thing to think about when we place ourselves in relation to other species. And in a book that I published last year called The Human Instinct, How Evolution Gave Us Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will, I wrote that the obsession of evolutionary psychology to reach deep in the past, to find hidden chains that bind us, must be paired with the realization, while we are finding these constraints in our behavior, that we're the only creatures able to perceive these psychological chains, to rise above them, and to achieve an independence of thought, action, and creativity that makes possible the lasting achievements of our species. So we are creatures like no other, and we should never forget that. So my answer to Marilyn Robinson is this. Far from diminishing us, and her book was called The Death of Adam. She's not a believer in a literal Adam and Eve, but she thought the myth of Adam helped to give our species a special status. Evolution took it away, and we are the poorer for it. But I would say to her that far from diminishing us, knowing the details of Adam's journey, meaning our own evolution, ennobles each of us as a carrier of something truly precious, which is the genetic, biological, and cultural heritage of life itself. Evolution describes not the death of Adam, but his triumph. And that is the great truth of our story as a species. Now, when I was trying to wrap up that book, I was struggling with the last chapter. And everyone writes books in a different way. For me, the hardest page of a chapter of the book is the first page, because the first page sets where I'm going. And I labored over this for months. I wouldn't say I had writer's block. I was doing other stuff. I wouldn't want to glorify my own work to say I had writer's block. But I was trying to think out, how do I begin this? If my girls were here, they're now in their 40s, but when they were little, they would tell you that Dad was an astronomy nut. And they would remember that I would drag them out at 2 a.m. to see a lunar eclipse. I would drag them out at midnight, cover them with mosquito repellent, lay them down on chairs, and look up at the night sky to watch meteor showers. And I remember Lauren, my oldest, who's a wildlife biologist now, first time I did this, she really resisted. I made them lie out, and we must have been lying there for, 15 minutes. And I had seen a couple glimmers of a meteor shower, and I tried to point them out to her, but she didn't see them right away. And she's saying, Dad, I can't take this anymore, I'm going. And then as she was about to say, I'm going inside, a meteor just seared across the sky and practically lit up our backyards. And she said, oh my God. And after that, she never hesitated again. So I thought, I know how I can characterize the view of our species that I want to convey to my readers. So I started the chapter off this way. I said, I'm hoping for a clear sky. It's expected to be the peak of the Perseid meteor shower. And for me, this is a chance to glory in streaks of sudden fire. As fragments of a comet come crashing through the Earth's atmosphere, in between these moments of spectacle, there will be a chance to lie still in the darkness and absorb the quiet beauty of the nighttime sky. Of all the creatures, of all the forms of life that grace the surface of this small planet, only one creature looks this way into the nighttime sky. Only one knows the Perseid is coming. Only one contemplates the age of the universe. Only one is aware of the mysteries to be solved in starlight. While all of life is one, linked by ancestry, structure, and design, only the human creature seeks answers to questions in the stars. And for me, that is the human difference. That is why our presence on this planet amounts to nothing less than the universe becoming conscious of itself. We are the cosmos waking up, and we are the instruments of its self-awareness. I remember another lecture, another topic back at my university, showing this picture of the Earth from space, actually from the surface of the moon, and saying, look how small we are. Look how insignificant we are. Look how little we matter to the cosmos. Well, maybe so, but I like to show the rest of the picture. And if you want to know why we are a species that matters, 50 years ago, what you see right there, the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, that is what makes our species different. We are, and Carl Sagan liked to say this, we are the universe waking up and becoming aware of itself. So when people ask me, what is your attitude towards evolution? Do you find evolution degrading or demoralizing? Isn't it depressing to think that you're just an animal? I generally say no. I'm sort of turned on by the whole thing. And I've searched for words to capture it fully, and I've never got them quite right. So I think the best way to summarize the evolutionary view of life is by quoting words that were written down by the very same person who made this diagram. Now, he made this diagram in the mid-1840s. You can see that he drew a tree, and it was a kind of tree that no one had ever drawn before. So it's very rare that you can look at one page in a scientist's notebook and say, right there on that page is one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time. And you can see that what he did at the top is he wrote in his very bad handwriting, I think. Then he showed this tree, and then a couple weeks later he came back with some explanatory notes written on the right-hand side. And the person who wrote this diagram is the person who wrote the following at the end of a famous book that you've all heard of. And he said he didn't find evolution depressing at all. He said, on the contrary, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And while this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I will submit to you that those are words to live by. Thank you very much for tonight.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.